Hello, friends. This is Mr. Alper, and today we're going to learn a little bit about the basic elements of language. This is divided in two parts. So today we're going to look at some of the very general terms about how language works, or at least how we study the way in which language works. We're going to talk about two very commonly used terms that are often applied to writing and language in general, and that's grammar and usage. So first, let's look at the word grammar. What is grammar? Grammar is one of the things that's taught in English classes that a lot of people, and language classes, that a lot of people think is boring, but without it, nothing we say would make sense. So what is it? Grammar is simply the structure of language, the way in which words are put together in a language so that they make sense, so that they actually communicate ideas rather than simply exist as isolated words referring to things. So it's the way we put the words together to create meaning, okay, to create additional meaning. Words themselves individually can refer to something, but they don't mean more than just the one thing they refer to unless they're combined in ways that make sense. And in every grammar, every language, there's a logic. There's a rational way in which a pattern in which words are put together so that people who know how to use that language understand their relationship. So even though grammar may seem something alien, something you have to study, that it's abstract, that it's not really related to really being able to communicate, what it refers to is the underlying patterns that any language has that create meaning. Pretty much every known language, I don't know of any language that exists that's actually considered a real language. Actually, every language has a grammar built into it. And if it's a naturally emerging language rather than one that was invented by scholars or screenwriters, if it's a natural language, it has a grammar that emerged with it, that's built into the way the language works. Because of that, just like the evolution of bodies, of physical beings, of plants and animals, which they can change, but they change very gradually over time from one species to another, grammar in languages also tends to change very, very slowly. English, for example, is a language where we typically put the subject before the verb and then an object after the verb. I speak English. I is the subject, speak is the verb, English is the object of the verb. It says what I speak. I speak English. That word order is built into the grammar of English. If I said English I speak, well, you might make sense of it, but that's not the natural word order in English. Or if I said speak English I, that wouldn't even make any sense. That would be too far from the natural grammar of English. Although there are languages that put their sentences together in that order. We distinguish between grammar, the underlying logic with which a language puts words together into sentences. We distinguish that from usage. They overlap a lot, though. Usage is the set of rules we use with language, or that we say we should use. That is what we consider good usage of language, or appropriate, or formal versus informal. So usage refers to the way in which all these elements, the words, phrases, punctuation, spelling, capitalization, all those things, usage refers to the way we actually use them in practice, and what people like teachers or editors tell you should be using under the circumstances. Those kinds of elements of language, like how to punctuate, when to capitalize, that can change pretty quickly. It can change from one day to the next. A new word can be introduced, or somebody can come up with a new way of using a verb. I remember when I first started hearing people say, my bad. Bad is an adjective. It's usually used to describe something else, right? My bad behavior. And the first time I heard somebody say, my bad, I understood immediately what it meant, but it was a pretty new phrase then, back in the 80s or something. So, and then it caught on, and it's now pretty much a standard, although an informal part of English. So usage can change pretty quickly. And it's basically, unlike grammar, which is really baked into the language. Usage can usually be a matter of just what people agree to, either informally, when when people started using "my bad" and people understood what it meant, and then it became a pretty common expression, or it can be one that's actually stated, where a teacher may tell you, do it this way, punctuate it this way, capitalize it that way, use this form of the past tense. Okay. So it's something that may actually be taught or required by editors or teachers, or it may just be something that people over time agree, well, yeah, that's the form we're going to use. Now, where they overlap, where grammar and usage overlap, is where we make the distinction between descriptive and prescriptive grammar. You don't need to memorize these terms or anything. It's just a useful distinction to know. When we talk about improving your grammar in your writing, for example, there's such a thing as what linguists call, people who study language, called descriptive grammar. And that's simply the study of how people put words and phrases and clauses together to create sentences. So, as you said, it just simply describes how people are using language. And when linguists do that, when they describe a grammar, they're not making any judgment about what's good grammar or bad grammar. They just say, oh, that's how people use it. That's the way the language works. So all descriptive grammarians are doing is simply identifying the patterns that people actually use when they put words together into sentences. Prescriptive grammar is the set of rules that really reflect more the uses, what's considered good usage under the circumstances. So it's a set of rules about what's considered proper use of the language in the situation. That means in the circumstance in which the language is being used. So it dictates. People using prescriptive grammar are prescribing or dictating or instructing or requiring that language be used in a certain way. For example, we say put periods at the end of sentences, or use went as the past tense of go rather than goed as the past tense. Those are rules that we set up that are supposed to be consistent with the underlying grammar. They may change from time to time, but we dictate. Somebody in authority or somebody who is helping you to shape your language use tells you, prescribes this particular way of putting sentences together. So to make distinctions between right or wrong, not necessarily right or wrong absolutely, but rather in terms of the particular circumstance in which the language is being used. And we usually make a distinction between standard and non-standard use. So we teach you standard English in English class. Non-standard forms of English are perfectly acceptable in other circumstances. So I've kind of hinted at this. What's right? Well, what's right, whether to use descriptive or prescriptive grammar, depends on how you're using the language. So people who study language say, no, as long as language is functioning at all, if people are able to make each other understood using words, the language is working. But there are certain usages of language that are considered incorrect or inappropriate for the circumstances. So again, one of the things we are teaching you to do in English class is to use certain standards of English that are considered appropriate and accepted in educated settings. So why do we have to learn the rules at all of prescriptive grammar or usage? Well, as I said, in educational and many professional settings, standard English is the accepted norm. And I said many professional settings. I mean, if you work in a factory or someplace where more advanced levels of formal education are not the norm or not expected, then that kind of usage may actually be out of place, more formal usage. I'm talking about professional settings, though, such as doctors' offices or law firms, things like that. So in many of those settings, standard English is the accepted norm. So if you don't use it, you're considered either uneducated or simply badly prepared or disrespectful of the expectations. Another reason to learn those rules is because even though I'm making the point that there is no such thing as wrong or right English, but simply wrong or right for the circumstances, in the real world, a lot of people will look down on others who fail to use or don't know how to use standard English, and will look down on them as being uneducated or lacking class. And in many cases, that's totally unfair. There are plenty of brilliant people who can brilliantly use language, just not the standard form of English, the standard educated form of English, um, and who don't deserve to be looked down on. But it happens. So people will sneer at people who use the wrong past tense form of a word or something like that. So it's worth it just to maintain a status in society, to know how to, as some people say, to code shift, to use the accepted form of standard English wherever that's called for. So that's it for these basic elements of language, part one. There's going to be a part two, which gets a little more into the weeds, gets into more depth about some of the bits and pieces of language. So stay tuned for that part. Thanks, Trevor. See you then.